Hello, everyone, and welcome to the TDWI webinar program. I'm Brenda Woodbridge, and I'll be your moderator. For today's program, we're going to talk about the best practices for de-risking your cloud modernization in financial services. Our sponsor today is Yellowbrick. For our presentations today, we'll first hear from David Loshin with Knowledge Integrity. After David speaks, Mark Cusack with Yellowbrick and Richard Soundy will join him for a roundtable discussion. But before I turn over the time to our speakers, I'd like to go over a few basics. Today's webinar will be about an hour long. At the end of the roundtable discussion, our speakers will host a question and answer period. If at any time you'd like to submit a question, just use the Ask a Question area on your screen. If you have any technical difficulties during the webinar, click on the Help area located below the slide window and you'll receive assistance. If you'd like to discuss this webinar on Twitter with fellow attendees, just include the hashtag TDWI in your tweets. Finally, if you'd like a copy of today's presentation, use the Click Here for a PDF line there on the left middle of your console. In addition, we are recording today's event and we'll be emailing you a link to an archived version so you can view the presentation again later if you'd like, or feel free to share it with a colleague. So again, today we're going to talk about best practices for de-risking your cloud modernization in financial services. Our first speaker today is David Loshin. David Loshin is the president of Knowledge Integrity, a consulting company focusing on information management solutions for information quality, business intelligence, and metadata management. David is a recognized expert in information management and writes and speaks on the topic frequently, including at TDWI conferences and events. David is also an affiliate analyst with TDWI and the program director for the Master of Information Management program at the University of Maryland. David, welcome. I'll turn it over to you now.
Thanks, Brenda, and thank you to TDWI for giving me the opportunity to chat today, and also thanks to the Yellowbrick folk who we've had some interesting conversations, and I think that today's roundtable discussion is going to highlight some interesting aspects of de-risking cloud modernization. So what are we going to talk about today? Well, there have been some fundamental changes in the financial services industry, and we're going to look at some of those changes and some of the implications of those, and the opportunities for improving competitiveness through modernization, especially through modernizing to the cloud. We're going to talk a little bit about the different types of risk, and then we're going to look at opportunities for de-risking auditable compliance and customer experience and information protection and concentration risks. So let's focus on this a little bit. What are some of the fundamental changes? A lot of them have to do with the way that customers are dealing with financial institutions and the opportunities that new upstart disruptors in the industry have kind of come online. So I put together a slide here with about, I guess there's about 9 items that are focusing on changes in the financial services, ranging from and I'm going to go from left to right. The customer experience has changed, where it used to be that customers would deal with each area of the business independently. Now, digital natives, millennials, are used to having an expectation of full visibility into all aspects of the relationship with their service and product providers. And so there's a higher degree of expectation for what the financial institutions are able to provide, especially in real time, reflecting on the point that there's lots of different types of products and services that these organizations provide, and be able to get visibility into that data in real time and produce a consistent view that lends credence and level of trust to the customers. That in its own right is dependent on going beyond the firewalls of our traditional data centers and actually going outside of our environments to a partner network of organizations that are sometimes sharing data, sometimes are creating data products, but visibility in the practice of pulling data from all sorts of different sources and being able to deliver a consistent message. I mentioned the fintech disruptors. These are digital only or emerging different types of organizations that are not your existing legacy institutions, and they have jumped into the digital-only space and are able to be a lot more nimble in certain areas. Fraud detection used to be kind of the mantra, but now it's really fraud prevention. It's no longer a question of being able to find the people who have executed the fraud and then trying to chase after them to reclaim the money that's been stolen, but rather identifying and preventing these fraudulent transactions from taking place in the first place. There's compliance has always been an issue in the financial industry, but now there's a growing number of different types of laws, regulations, many of them having to do with data protection, with data privacy, with personal data, but a lot of others that remain, and I'm sure we're going to talk about some of them in our conversation. If we go down to the second tier, we've got technology limitations, and a lot of the systems that were designed and built for heritage legacy financial institutions was designed and organized decades ago. Many of these systems are still in production. The people who have designed them have long since retired, but there have been what I refer to as technical debt, where decisions were made about the available technology at the time, and that's got fully integrated into the perception of what the business processes are, when in fact they are impediments to being able to migrate away from those limitations, because there's new technologies that free us from having to rely on doing things the way that they used to be done. There are emerging standards for data sharing, for data exchange, as well as the opportunities that can be leveraged based on new types of standards and data sharing agreements. There's a question of counterparty risk and knowing exactly who you're dealing with and who your parties are. And then finally, maintaining the high level of performance. There's expectations for ensuring that not only can you satisfy the concurrent needs of all your consumers, data consumers, but that as you are expanding out your app network and interchanges to provide that rich customer experience, that doesn't degrade performance in the environment. So there is a lot of talk about modernization. In fact, there is a pressure to rapidly modernize if you want to maintain some degree of competitiveness, because legacy banking companies are at risk of being eclipsed by the digital first or the digital only online banks or the neobanks. And so if you need to shift towards customer focused digital banking, you need to understand what the requirements are going to be in your system environment to be able to satisfy the massive amount of data that needs to be moved, ingested, processed, managed, stored, analyzed, and be able to produce the type of results, analytical results, that are going to improve that customer experience. Problem is that modernization is not easy. There's a lot of inertial constraints that prevent organizations from being able to just say, yes, we're going to ditch our entire system and move to a completely new system. We've had this experience with some of our customers where they just kind of nibble around the edges when it comes to modernization. They look at some of the external capabilities that they can replace with microservices, but they're too afraid to dive directly into the midst of that legacy system. So yes, it is true, there are hurdles in modernizing the existing systems, and you don't want that to be an impediment to being able to get back into a competitive stature. So if you look at what the risks are of continuing with an existing on-premises legacy platform, you'll get an understanding as to why there's an opportunity to really change the way you do business if you modernize, and particularly if you modernize to the cloud. So some of those issues involve the information gap, being able to meet emerging business demands that didn't exist when their systems were originally designed. The legacy platforms themselves require maintenance and management, and a lot of those aspects are addressed by migrating to the cloud, where the maintenance and management of the underlying architectures are part of the service that the cloud service provider enables. if you look at some of the existing implementations, they're dependent on technologies that have or are rapidly reaching their end of life, and that becomes a very big risk. You also have this potential single points of failure that if there's one particular part of the process that breaks down, it will bring down the entire capability to be able to produce in a reasonable time. I made a reference to technical debt before. Modernization essentially gives you an opportunity to pay down some of that technical debt by getting rid of it or kind of clearing out the cobwebs that are collecting dust around the innards of your legacy systems. And additionally, there are risks that are posed by tribal knowledge as well as turf protection that often happens as part of the socio-technical perspectives associated with modernization of a system. So these are some of the issues that we're going to try to chat about in our panel in a few minutes. Before we start that, let's ask a poll. Where are you on your cloud journey? So we're going to give everybody about 30 to 60 seconds to respond to this. We have 4 choices. We have still on-premises. We have hybrid of an on-premises and a cloud implementation. We've got all in one cloud and in multiple clouds. We've seen from some of the work that we've done with some of our clients, we've seen every single one of these alternatives. Mostly organizations that are on their journey perhaps are either in multiple clouds or all in one cloud. One of the things that we often see are organizations where there's organic evolution of their cloud journey. So I think we've had enough time for folks to answer the poll. So I'm going to move to the poll answers. So 44% has got a hybrid of on-prem and cloud. That is not unexpected. Interestingly, the answer that is the lowest is all in one cloud, and that makes sense because different cloud vendors are able to provide different types of services at different levels of service. And I think we'll use that as an opportunity to kind of drill down into some of the questions that we've got for our panel. But what I'm going to do now is we'll come back to this as part of the conversation, but I'm going to ask Brenda if she would please introduce our panelists, and then we can move into the discussion.
Great. Thank you very much, David. And just a quick reminder to the audience, if you have any questions, enter them at any time in the Ask a Question window. We'll get to those in the final portion of today's program. But it is now my pleasure to introduce our 2 panelists for today. First is Mark Cusack, CTO of Yellowbrick. Before joining Yellowbrick, Mark was Vice President for Data and Analytics at Teradata, where he led a variety of product management and technology teams in data warehousing and advanced analytics groups. He was also Chief Architect of Teradata's IoT analytics effort. Mark joined Teradata in 2014 when Teradata acquired the startup Rainstore, where he was a co-founding developer and chief architect. Prior to Rainstore, Mark was a lead scientist in the UK Ministry of Defence. Mark holds a PhD in computational physics from Newcastle University in the UK, with a thesis centered on discovering the electronic and nonlinear optical properties of quantum dots. As a research fellow at Newcastle, he developed new techniques to model these novel quantum structures using large-scale parallel and distributed computing approaches. And joining him today is Richard Soundy. Richard worked at Sybase and SAP for 24 years, working in engineering roles with SAP ASE and SAP IQ. He was with SAP IQ since the original product was purchased by Sybase back in the early 90s, and has worked with IQ in engineering, marketing, business development, and evangelism. Richard took early retirement from SAP as the EMEA director in the SAP Enterprise Systems Group in 2015. Since his retirement, he has been consulting with data warehouse companies where his knowledge of IQ in the market can be usefully employed. Welcome, Mark and Richard. And I'll turn it back to you, David.
Yes, welcome. You guys, obviously, you have a long pedigree of experience and expertise in high-performance distributed computing, and so I'm very honored to have both of you be able to share your thoughts today. Let's focus a little bit. Let's drill down directly and start off with talking about financial services clients. And Richard, let me start with you. What do financial services organizations see as being the most challenging issues that need to be addressed, and how are these issues compounded by legacy technology?
Well, as you said in your presentation, David, the legacy systems can be a huge millstone around the neck. But at this precise moment, I would probably suggest that it's changes to the regulatory environment and changes, sometimes very rapid changes to the overall financial landscape. I mean, given current events as we have in Europe, such as Brexit and severing of some of the links between the UK and the rest of Europe, ongoing issues between Russia and Ukraine, recovery from COVID, which is hitting all of us, there is substantial confusion in all the communities. We have existing systems. We have existing systems that work, existing legacy systems. The problem we have is that in a number of cases, they can't change fast enough. This isn't, I mean, we don't like to use that wonderful phrase that salespeople use, which is agility and flexibility. But it is quite true, as you said. Most of the systems, certainly the big iron systems at the back end, they are not agile. They're not flexible. So to be honest, it's a multifaceted answer. It's regulatory environments, it's problems with existing systems. And sometimes, as you say, the legacy drag on, you've actually got to take it on, and sometimes moving an application, as we're saying here, from on-premise to cloud actually can help in a number of different ways.
Thanks. Mark, thoughts about some of the clients that you've spoken to with respect to some of the challenges?
Yeah, and I mean, not only are we seeing the kind of regulatory challenges that Richard mentioned, I think in general, enterprises in financial services are challenged by the sheer complexity within their analytical ecosystems. Again, kind of speaks to a little bit of what Richard was mentioning. But I think if you look at a world where almost every organization is undergoing some degree of digital transformation, it's a much more connected world these days than it ever has been. There are way more channels for interacting with your customers. There's a massive increase in automation, a need for more closer to real-time interactions with customers, and very different changing customer expectations. I think over the course of the pandemic, we've seen the way that people interact with their bank has changed significantly, obviously a lot more towards mobile. And with that has come more challenges around, like you mentioned earlier, David, fraud prevention, fraud detection. I think the instances of fraudulent activity online have gone up by something like 250% over the last year or two. So significant challenge there. But I think you've got a backdrop against. We're operating in an environment in which you've got highly complex, siloed data across your organization. I've spoken to financial services organizations that have cataloged something like 15,000 individual siloed data systems across their organizations. And so I think we're dealing with just sort of the legacy growth of a massive amount of complexity over time. And that's the biggest challenge that I hear.
So let's drill down on a bit about that. I mean, you talk about complexity. I've heard people saying that they believe that the cloud is complex, and so Mark, let's focus on that. What differentiates the cloud from a traditional on-premises reporting, BI, and analytics platform architecture? I mean, why would that be? Why would that simplify things? And what are the significant differences that would motivate an organization to want to slay that dragon, as I think Richard referred to?
Yeah, I mean, the interesting thing is it's not really simpler in the cloud by virtue of it being the cloud, but usually by virtue of replatforming from an on-prem complex environment to something simpler. And I think that's what a lot of organizations take the opportunity to do when they move to the cloud. They rethink their legacy data pipelines. I mean, in many cases, the 5,000 Informatica ETL jobs that are feeding your data warehouse will still be 5,000 jobs when they move to the cloud. But in other instances, it's an opportunity to kind of really simplify your processes when you do that replatform anyway. And to some degree, you might find that simplification if you're simply modernizing your on-premises data warehouse in addition to moving to the cloud. I think one area where perhaps there is a distinction is around the use of native cloud services around your data management platform there, whether it's the security services, the data governance services. And I think there's an opportunity for a degree of kind of introducing some homogeneity in the way that you plug these things together, which you don't necessarily get when you operate outside of a single cloud vendor.
So that's interesting. I mean, the perspective that you just kind of gave was focusing more still at the technical level, and if I can just kind of reflect back what you said, it's that the one of the benefits is that by reviewing how the actual application works in the existing legacy system, an organization can gain some insight into how that implementation could be improved. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, very, very much. Yeah, it's like I mentioned, it's really an opportunity to take a kind of a root and branch approach and look at what you're doing in your legacy on-prem environment, and looking, and what I see that a lot of companies do is they take kind of a piecemeal approach to moving into the cloud. They'll pick some low-hanging fruit, some applications that they can move easily, prove business value, and then kind of rinse and repeat.
So, Richard, what other kinds of benefits would financial services institutions get from migrating to the cloud? What are your thoughts?
Well, an awful lot of what Mark has just said. One of the big areas that we notice is simplification of the overall system. As Mark said, you've got 5,000 ETL tasks. You probably needed them 8 years ago. You don't need them now. One major benefit that's always touted as far as moving to the cloud is cost, and maybe we should address this. Moving to the cloud doesn't necessarily save the institution capital expenditure cost. It can save it operational expenditure once the systems are up, but in a lot of ways, as Mark has said, as you have said, you've got to redesign. You've got to look at taking those applications that you can get a swift bang for your buck, if you like, move those applications, maybe simplify them as well, and gradually take it across into the cloud. I don't think you can achieve anything by just doing a root and branch, move everything into the cloud. Point number one is I'm not sure that would ever work. And it would be still incredibly complex to try and engineer and to manage. The biggest plus from a technology perspective is stability of the underlying platforms. The underlying cloud platforms are easier to manage because you don't have to. They're easier to maintain because you don't have to. The flexibility to change or move hosting environments is also very, very simple using things like Kubernetes now, rather than just having a native on iron in the cloud. And there's a substantial reduction in what we should, as we're talking to a financial institution, refer to as the technical risk. The technical risk to operation of these systems is substantially lower. There are other risks that we'll probably talk about a bit later on.
So, Mark, let me go back to you on that. I mean, let's say you want to ratchet it up because you're talking to the CEO. They're not going to understand if you're talking about the underlying technology infrastructure and the pipelines and the integration. Is there some higher level quantification of benefits that are specific to financial services institutions that you might want to share?
Well, I think there are many benefits, one of which from a business perspective I think is really important, and I think a lot of, actually not just financial services industries, a lot of different verticals are seeing benefit when they move to the cloud, and it is that agility, frankly. It's the ability to very quickly think up and test out new use cases and new products in the cloud in a way that you couldn't necessarily do in a more fixed form that you had before. And so, you can imagine creating new banking applications, doing more sophisticated ML training on a model for fraud detection or whatever, and trying new things that ultimately will build out and develop new business value, that they'll deliver that business value that you didn't have before and couldn't do when you were operating in more of a fixed on-prem environment. So, when you also look at what else is available in the public cloud and how quickly you can connect to other services to add value, and the ability to combine publicly available data sets very quickly with your own proprietary data to add more color around, for example, a customer or demographics and things like that. And I think it'll help to provide additional accuracy for things like customer interaction management and things like that. Thanks.
Richard, you made a comment a little bit before, and I want to cycle back to that. When we talked, you were talking about migrating root and branch, which I think we've used the term lift and shift as well to talk about replicating a footprint in the cloud. And your comment was, I'm not even sure if that would work. So, and you've got a different perspective as well, because, with your experience in some of the existing tools like Sybase IQ, which is designed to optimize for a lot of the same points that cloud-based data warehouses are designed to optimize for in terms of data latency, et cetera. So what is the difference between replicating an on-premises data warehouse in the cloud as opposed to modernizing to a cloud-based data warehouse solution?
Okay, well, the biggest difference is always assuming that it's possible, always assuming that you can have the diversity of systems and diversity of connections that you have on-premise. We potentially might be talking about 30, 40, 50, 60 computers, different computers running different parts of the application. Yes, of course, you can have these all hosted on the cloud. Yes, some of the interconnects between these systems are going to be a lot faster. But all you're doing is duplicating your existing system. You are achieving nothing except possibly a cost benefit. There may be a cost benefit, and sometimes that's a little bit difficult to achieve. Now, you have resilience issues. You're running on a cloud server and the cloud server goes down. These things do happen. Our dear friends at Amazon had this issue earlier on this year, late on last year. Your protection of your system and your data is different when you're running in the cloud as to when you're running on-premise. If you're running on-premise, you can iron wall the systems. You can protect absolutely everything. You don't have that degree of super protection inside the cloud that you might have on an on-premise solution. That's just one of the many areas that you've got to address if you are going to do a root and branch or lift and shift. And one of the advantages of doing a big move, and it is a big move to move from on-premise to cloud, one of the advantages you can achieve is to be able to modernize existing systems. As Mark said, you've got a highly complex application. That highly complex application may be because of changes to regulatory authorities, changes to data sovereignty rules, changes to whatever. That highly complex application may not, it may not be necessary anymore and is only used in a very minor part of your overall system. Or it may be used in such a way that it could be engineered and designed simpler. Use the opportunity of moving into the cloud as an opportunity to redesign and re-engineer parts of your application. Undoubtedly, I would suggest, we did a poll some 10 years ago, so that's in history really. But 10 years ago, we did a poll with three large financial institutions in the City of London. And the general consensus was that 48% of the code that was running on the servers was never used. And another 20% was only used once or at most 3 times a year. By analyzing your current use of your systems and analyzing how well the systems can change the flexibility and agility, sorry, mentioned them again. By analyzing those, you can simplify your overall systems very, very easily. Use the cloud migration as a means of simplifying your overall system application, your overall system architecture.
Mark, some thoughts about the differences between root and branch versus modernizing, and just to kind of summarize, Richard, one of the things that sounded like you were saying is that the modernization approach in which you're reconsidering or rethinking how your system is supporting business needs would allow you to refactor the application and target it towards the cloud architecture. So, Marks, anything to add to that?
I mean, like as I mentioned earlier, I think it's a byproduct of moving to the cloud, and a lot of folks take that opportunity to re-architect their entire data management and analytics kind of strategy as well, and take a fresh approach to how they implement these things. So I see that happening a lot. And you know, I'd actually respectfully disagree with something Richard said earlier on the call around high availability in the cloud versus an on-prem data center. And I've heard many and seen many horror stories of lack of availability in a single company's data center and breaches there. And I think in some ways the cloud gives you an opportunity to hedge your bets and put in place high availability and disaster recovery schemes, not just spanning different regions in one cloud provider, but across multi-cloud as well. I mean, there are ways, or even hybrid cloud, multi-cloud. So I think there are ways that you can kind of address that problem.
Thanks. So one of the things that sounded like you were saying is that, you know, it is a difficult thing to do to really re-architect. That is a little bit of a high hurdle to jump. And those organizations that have done so, I would assume that they have also experienced other types of hurdles as well. So, you know, what are some of the hurdles that your customers have faced once they've decided to do this migration to the cloud?
So some of the main hurdles is that it quickly becomes apparent to anyone who's sort of feet on the ground doing these kinds of things that you simply don't pick up a data warehouse, copy the data over to something in the cloud, and off we go to the races. It's the data movement between something on-prem and even a new data warehousing platform in the cloud is pretty trivial, to be honest. That's not where the problem lies. It's about all of the interconnecting tissue around that data warehouse that exists on-prem. So it's all the upstream data pipelines and ETL work that goes on, and all the downstream applications that need to be kind of re-evaluated, perhaps skinnied down, re-implemented, and a lengthy kind of Q&A process to make sure that you're still getting the right financial results if you're relying on that system to do your kind of end of quarter book management and closing, for example. So I would say the biggest challenge that some of our customers that have gone on that journey with us from on-prem to the cloud has been around moving and modifying a lot of that ETL tasks. And we have customers in this industry with 5,000 plus ETL tasks or more. And in fact, the biggest challenge there was not as much around re-implementing the ETL, was really around making sure that they were getting the right numbers, the right results, that kind of Q&A process at the end.
So let me poke at that a little bit. It sounds like, or I'm inferring from some of the things that you guys are saying, is that when you do look at the way these systems are architected and on-prem and the historical, and Richard, you kind of referred to I think it was Richard, that significant amount of code was never run or only runs once or twice a year. So here you've got a lot of code that might be just existing. I'm not going to use the word trash, but it's kind of hovering around stuff that doesn't necessarily add any value. And Mark, you were just referring to pipelines, upstream pipelines, downstream pipelines, data integration. How do you spend, what's the right way to rethink even the needs for data integration? Because one of the things that I've been hearing from a bunch of folks who have migrated to the cloud is that you don't really need to do the integration anymore, because your data is available to you in real time, or so they say. So thoughts about that, Richard? I'll poke at you first on that one, and then we'll come back to Mark.
Oh, thank you very much, David. Yes, it's technology changes, and I think that's the biggest thing that when you look at a legacy system versus a system that was designed today or yesterday. Technology changes. There are so many things you can do now that you could not do 20 years ago or 30 years ago. And some of these legacy systems are 20 and 30 years old. They rely on, it's quite a modern system that relies on a real ETL tool. A lot of the ETL tools still used in the big banks today are C-level programs. God's sake, I hope there are no COBOL programs left, and I'm probably the only person on this call who knows what a COBOL program is. But anyway, moving on.
There's actually a huge amount of COBOL code still out there.
Dear.
So I'd be surprised if there weren't a lot.
No, that is very true. But it's taking the opportunity again to be able to do this, and some of the things like the reconciliation in data warehouses. I have built systems in the past that have had to pre-calculate everything because the data warehouse, the database that controlled the data warehouse, just wasn't fast enough to be able to do the reconciliation. Nowadays, you don't need to do that. You're almost, not quite, and this is a very arrogant way of putting it, you're almost just throwing the data into a big bucket, and your query becomes your reconciliation process. The queries run that fast, the databases run that fast, that you don't have to have complex data massaging of input data. You can just run with it. Again, this is an advantage you can take with you when you move to the cloud, because you'll be using, hopefully, modern hardware and modern software.
Mark, you want to add to that?
Yeah, so you mentioned that, in kind of more modern cloud architectures, folks might not be using ETL in the same way they have done in the past, and I think that is true to some degree. And if you look at kind of a modern architecture for data management and analytics in the public cloud, it's usually some combination of a data lake and data warehouse kind of play in place. And you've got raw data hitting your object storage in cloud, and then you might be using some sort of Spark-based task to do some data preparation and data processing. You might be moving more to kind of an ELT approach and getting the data warehouses to do a lot of this kind of data processing and integration itself directly. And then, quite often you're publishing data artifacts and data products back out to the lake or something to be consumed by other applications. So definitely the kind of more of a modern kind of data management and architecture plan has come about around in the cloud. That's certainly the case.
Thanks. I think we have another poll. What are your biggest concerns running cloud data warehousing? And select all that apply. So again, I think we're going to give 30 to 60 seconds for this. The choices are security, governance, cost, performance, and other. And if you want to use a Q&A to write in some answers for that, that would be great as well. Kind of reflecting back on that prior poll where we had a bunch of folks had responded that they were both they were hybrid. They were both on-prem and the cloud. What do you guys think? 10 seconds. What do you think of what that actually means? Let's go to you, Mark, first.
Yeah, that is that is no surprise to me. I think particularly in the markets that we serve, I think banks and financial services are taking a very considered approach to what they move to the cloud, and there'll be hybrid configurations will be here for a long time to come.
Richard, your thoughts?
Oh, I agree. the concept of just being purely in existence in a single cloud is very, very limited. I mean, there will be applications that reside in a single cloud, but for data compliance reasons, hybrid clouds or multi-clouds or hyper-clouds, thank you, those are going to be the way forward, simply for data security and resilience.
Thanks. Before we go to the results, just a reminder to the audience, if you've got questions you'd like to ask Richard or Mark, please put them into the Q&A box that's at the bottom of your screen. And let's take a look at this result. Okay, well, cost seems to be the leader here with almost 43%. Does that surprise you guys?
To some degree, the cost. Oh, actually, yeah, the cost, as in, is it going to be more expensive than I think it is? Yeah, then that's no surprise. Yeah, it will be.
Yeah,
yes,
it's interesting. What do you? Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, David. Cost is always the number one selling point for cloud migrations. It very rarely comes out when you finally do the washing at the end of the installation that you've achieved those substantial savings of costs that you'd like to, but all the drag-ons like security and governance is important. I'm interested to note that actually performance is the lowest.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that, your thoughts about that.
Well, actually, I just want to pick up on, because I made a superficial comment about cost being more important, but I actually, there's quite a nuanced thing I just quickly want to mention here is you've also got to balance it with the return on investment when you move to the cloud here. And what you find out is when you're creating more use cases, creating things that are going to develop more business value, you might find that your cloud expenditure in data warehousing does go up, but the business returns are higher and obtained faster. So I've had plenty of conversations with financial services exactly around that idea. They're prepared to pay more in the cloud because they believe that the prerequisite kind of return on investment is going to be a lot higher.
Thanks, guys. Actually, Mark, you made a comment before about that led me to think about some of the use cases, particularly real-time analytics use cases. I think you made a reference earlier about real-time fraud prevention. I think the answer to the prior question before the poll, you also made a reference to real-time. So what emerging real-time analytics use cases are you seeing in the industry?
Well, I think the big two are kind of customer experience and also kind of that fraud protection, fraud prevention side of things as well. So I'm seeing banks who want to have a much more immersive experience, a better understanding and a better model of their customers, knowing full well that increasingly the way that we interact with them is through a web browser or a mobile application or something like this. And but what I'm very curious to see emerging is just the new sort of data sets that are coming in play and being integrated to feed some of these predictive models around it, because it's not all about sort of traditional demographic data now. It's the social media sort of component to this, which customers have an influence on other customers of mine. How can I measure the response rate of a particular campaign? Is geolocation a factor in how they do digital banking, for example? And I think this kind of way of interacting with customers, being able to put targeted in the moment offers to them based on their behavior and their journey is extremely important.
Thanks. The topic of our webinar is de-risking, and I wanted to kind of ask a little bit about your thoughts about different types of risks. And of course, we know that there's the standard types of risks that are in the financial services industry. Many of them around Mark, what you just talked about making sure that the customer has a consistent and meets the expectations for the customer experience. Real-time fraud prevention, but there's also the compliance issues having to do with know your customer or anti-money laundering. We're all familiar with that, but we know the financial services organizations have always depended heavily on technology. And are there new technology risks that are emerging from cloud migration? Richard, thoughts?
Oh, yes. Sorry, I was waiting for my name there, David. Do apologise. Yes, I think there are. I mean, splitting the risks up from technical risks on one aspect to financial risks on the other aspect. Let's look at the technical risks. You have many advantages to running in the cloud. You can ameliorate risk or remove a lot of risk using a cloud or a multi-cloud provider, certainly in terms of hardware failure, broadband pipes going down, the usual things that everybody has to think about. Not just the resilience of it, but recovery, of course, can be achieved an awful lot faster by having the advantages that a cloud-based solution will buy you. I'm less sure that there's any changes to the risk as associated with the risk in the financial community, such as portfolio management risk and counterparty risk and that sort of thing. That's design, platform, and implementation of the system. But there is a place that the regulatory authorities do have a vested interest. If an institution must report on its exposure, either on an instrument or institution basis, then this has a temporal aspect. The regulator or even higher management will want, need, or must provide this information in minutes or, at best case, hours. This then goes back to the technical risk. You have to have the system up. It has to be up, running, and performing queries, or at least those queries pertinent to the regulator or senior management. A single on-premise system can't ever provide this guarantee. Yes, we talk in terms of 99.999% uptime, but that's a mathematical figure. Something happens, something goes wrong. That's the 0.0001% of the chance. And nowadays, certainly with the regulator and certainly with some of the new regulations coming online, that's just not permitted. So you have to go back to duplicated systems on duplicated locations if you're on premise. But in the cloud, an awful lot of those advantages are bought as soon as you take a cloud solution on. The other perspective that we talked about cost, you've got to bear in mind that the cost for once it's implemented, the cost for an on-cloud solution is not capital expenditure anymore. It's purely operational expenditure. You need to upgrade the systems, fine. The cloud provider upgrades the hardware on the solutions. You don't even see it happening. You might get charged a little bit more money on a per monthly basis or a per annual basis, but you haven't had to spend $250,000 or $500,000 on a new bunch of hardware. So the type of costs that an uncloud solution has are different to those ones on an on-premise solution.
So, Mark, I preempted you to go to Richard, but it sounded like you had an answer that you wanted to share as well about the emerging risks that are emerging, technology risks.
Well, you kind of teed it up at the top of the call in your slides, David, around cloud concentration risk, and I do have quite a few conversations with financial services institutions that are concerned about when they move to the cloud. If they go with a single cloud, what does that mean from an operational and systemic risk perspective? If that cloud becomes unavailable for any length of time, and they've got their settlement and payment systems all running on that cloud, what's the business impact? And then, the financial regulators are concerned when lots of banks use the same particular cloud, for example. Is there a kind of a systemic risk to the broader system for outages on one particular cloud? And so, that's the conversation I have about how they can kind of mitigate that risk around either hybrid cloud solutions or looking at multi-cloud solutions and spreading some of the risk about.
Mark, let's switch gears a little bit. You mentioned customer experience. I mentioned customer experience. I used the term omnichannel, I think you also used a multi or omnichannel. Have there been changes in the ways that customers interact with the different financial services institutions? And are there particular risks that are emerging for the implementations that come from these expectations?
Yeah, and I think I touched on it a little bit earlier, where we're giving over more decision making to not rule-based model, but statistically based machine learning models for doing things like credit scoring and risk evaluation. And of course, there's an inherent risk there. Not only are we taking advantage of our ability to integrate more data to feed and train these models are becoming more complex. And then when you start to go down to the kind of deep learning side of things, then you start to get into a realm where model explainability becomes, very, very important. How you can weed out biases in the decisions that are being made by these automated models. Everyone wants that automation. They want to, take the time it takes to make a decision around the customer to the kind of think time around pressing a button on an application on their mobile, on their cell phone, for example. We want that, need that automation, but of course it comes with huge risks around how we can do these things without getting ourselves into trouble from a bias perspective.
So Mark, I'll throw one more question at you, and then I think I'm going to hand it back to Brenda for audience questions. For attendees that are currently developing their cloud strategy, what would you suggest as a number one aspect to consider?
As I think I've mentioned a couple of times, I think looking at it as an opportunity to redesign your entire ecosystem approach, I think is really important. This is a great opportunity to decide, if I'm going to do this again, how am I going to do it right, and what pieces are really important to me. I think it's also an opportunity to start to embrace new organizational changes around deploying in the cloud as well, because it's not just about technology. There's a people and process element that there's an opportunity to take a look at. And I think one kind of organizational approach and data management approach, if you like, that's getting a lot of attention right now are things like data mesh, where you kind of design data domains, keep the data close to the people that created it, make it their responsibility to maintain and govern that data and keep the quality of the data high, and have very clearly defined APIs between different data domains on how you exchange data and consume data. And I think a good thing to do is to consider how things like that data mesh strategy might fit around your overall cloud strategy and data management strategy as well. So those would be my thoughts.
Thanks. So, Brenda, I'm going to hand it back to you to field some of the audience questions.
Sounds great. Thank you, David. And thank you, Mark and Richard. So yeah, we'll go ahead and start with this one. I'll send it your way, Mark, and then Richard, if you have anything to add to it. I know you've touched on this a bit for sure, but someone's asking, what would you say are the top reasons that financial services organizations are making the switch to the cloud?
What are the top reasons that they're moving? I think it is to take advantage of new use cases. In some cases, it's a burn the ships approach, that they don't want their own data centers anymore. Other discussions I've had is they like the opportunity to be able to take advantage of data locality and data sovereignty, and make sure they adhere to things like GDPR and keep their data in the region and only in that region. So I mean, it's a mixed bag of a variety of reasons.
Perfect. Richard, do you have anything to add to that?
I think that what Mark said, plus a couple of other ones, is the moving of new applications to the cloud is inherently simpler, and it allows the customer to toe in the water just to test whether this is going to be a functional change that will be suitable for the organization. I think very few, if any, customers are prepared to just jump in with everything, the root and branch that we talked about earlier. I think it's selecting what application you want to do to see whether it works. I think we're still in the stage where some organizations are still dubious about the move to the cloud, and I think it's a testing process. The advantage, of course, you have with the cloud is you can start small and grow big.
Makes sense. There's one for you, Mark. Someone's asking, can you give a specific example of how you helped a financial services organization address their pain points?
Yeah, sure. So one of our customers is a Yellowbrick data warehouse user, and they effectively standardize on us for their enterprise data warehousing needs across the entire corporation. They're a very well-known credit card company, and they had a huge data lake that they were using to support the data exploration and analytics, ad hoc analytics requirements for a lot of their data scientists and business analysts. And so they weren't able to get the performance and the kind of real-time speed that they needed to ask these questions that they wanted of their kind of historical data of all of their financial transactions. And so they brought us in, and it's a multi-petabyte deployment. It's it satisfies their query SLAs, in many cases sub-second query response times. It simply was a much better price performance point than their previous incumbent solution. Great.
Here's one. I'll start with you, Mark, and maybe Richard has something to add to it. So someone's asking, I've been hearing from some vendors telling us that we don't need a data warehouse when we move to the cloud. How would you respond to that?
Right. I mean, yeah, I sometimes get involved in conversations where folks say, yeah, we're going to move and deploy on on something called a data lake house, which a few vendors are pushing, the kind of intersection of data warehousing and data lakes into this kind of data lake house concept. I'm a huge believer in the right tool for the right job. And if you're manipulating highly structured relational data, the best place to do that is in a dedicated database platform to do that. If you're looking at manipulating data which maybe has a little less structure to it that you want to apply structure to and pull out and tease out the structure out of it, then a data lake remains the same thing. And I think the companies that will be most successful and have that competitive disadvantage rather will be those ones that use the right tool for the right job. The data warehouse for the high performance, high concurrency reporting and analytics, and data lakes for doing things like data preparation and creating new data products.
Great. And Richard, do you have anything to add to that?
I think I would agree completely with that. I don't think even in existing organizations, any organization can say they have a data warehouse or a series of data lakes. Oh, I like data lake house. That's good. But yes, I think most organizations pick a name for their data store. Are they still going to need an individual single entry one-off data store? No, I don't think so, because I think the world is moving away from single data stores. I think there's very much more a requirement for not federated systems, but certainly distributed systems, improvement in reliance and all of that sort of thing. So I think, do we still need a data warehouse? Well, you might not call it that anymore, but you probably are.
Very good. All right, let's squeeze in this one last question. We'll just bounce back to you, Mark. Someone is asking, we would like to develop services that allow external parties to selectively access some of our data. How do you suggest any ideas on how we architect these services?
Right. Well, I mean, you've obviously got to look to the underlying platform that's going to serve these things. And, one pattern that's kind of emerging across the industry is you really want to make it as simple as possible to access this data at low cost to the end user. And in fact, I mean, some vendors are not necessarily looking at that, and they're almost biting from two sides of the pie at once by, offering a platform that has data sharing services. But by the way, your end users, your partners that want to consume the data, will have to spin up compute resources to be able to access that and pay for it, or you will pay for it to deliver that. And so I think one approach is looking for platforms that even the sheer sort of approach of sharing data with partners is going to be extremely costly and unpredictable as well, as it usually would be in the cloud. And of course, alongside that is all of the data protection, the security, and the governance that comes around about establishing the identity of the third party that's going to be accessing the data, having proper access control policies in place to ensure that they only get the data they are allowed to see, putting in masking in place for data in mixed kind of data sets and things like that. So obviously there's a huge security and governance set of things that you need to think about, but you also need to think about the costs of serving this stuff up as well.
Great. Thank you, Mark. So we have come, unfortunately, to the end of our time. So I just want to take a moment and thank our speakers today. We heard today from David Loshin with Knowledge Integrity, Mark Cusack with Yellowbrick, and Richard Soundy. Also, of course, a big thank you to Yellowbrick for sponsoring today's webinar, making this possible. Please remember that we recorded today's event and we'll be emailing you a link to an archived version of the presentation. Feel free to share that with colleagues. Also, if you'd like a copy of today's presentation, use the click here for a PDF line. Finally, I want to remind you that TDWI offers a wealth of information, including the latest research, reports, and webinars about BI, data warehousing, and a host of related topics. So I encourage you to tap into that expertise at tdwi.org. From all of us here today, let me say thank you very much for attending, and this does conclude today's event.